American Perspectives continues now with a discussion on television news. Earlier this year, the Columbia University School of Journalism hosted a panel discussion on TV news and the public interest. It included author and historian Richard Reeves and the former ABC and CNN news executive Rick Kaplan. This event lasts about an hour and a half.
My name is Richard Wald. I am a professor here at the School of Journalism, and it is my pleasure to introduce the chairman of our first panel called Setting a National Example. That chairman is Richard Reeves, who is progressing slowly toward the dais now. As always, an elderly person, he walks with a halting step. Mr. Reeves, as some of you may recall, had his glory days quite young. He worked for a newspaper and has been on a downhill track since then. He has been separated unhappily from the 3 commercial networks. He is now a syndicated columnist and author. In 1993, quite the consternation of his family, he wrote a book about President Kennedy that was said by Time magazine to be the best nonfiction book of the year. And to the surprise of many, has managed to be excellent in almost everything he does. And it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Richard Reeves, syndicated columnist, author, and former newspaper reporter.
Thank you. That is the best introduction I've ever had from someone who paid me. I stay up there? I was progressing slowly. Oh. While the hitters come up, I will say that's the best introduction I've ever had from a man who paid me $163.60 a week. Which, because the New York Herald Tribune, of which Dick was managing editor, and I was the youngest reporter, constitute a $70 a week raise from what they had been paying me at the Newark Evening News, which was a non-guild newspaper, and damn proud of it. It is a pleasure to be here. To progress slowly to this point, though I see other people are. If anyone has seen 13 Days, there is a scene in which John Scali of ABC News has a contact with the Russians, which indeed he did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the President of the United States informs him that he cannot use this information, and the President said the words the Presidents use is, "Well, John, there's no Pulitzer in this for you," when in fact he should have been saying, "Well, John, there's no DuPont in this for you." I think my qualification for doing this is that I'm progressing slowly toward the end, so that I live in 2 different times, and at least in terms of journalism, those times, the early 1970s and now the early 2000s, are quite different in terms. Even then, in the Kennedy period, when John Kennedy was president, the networks ran literally in prime time the Kennedy presidency week 1, the Kennedy presidency week 2, in an hour of prime time each week. But even in the 70s, there were regular kind of correspondent roundtables and evaluations of the policies of long before Watergate, the policies of the Nixon administration in a way that would seem laughable today, even on public television, and probably the only venue would be something like C-SPAN. At any rate, I'm not sure those are the things that we will be talking about. Certainly, there are three people to my left. Even I may be to Professor McChesney's right, but not by much. Who have really been on the front lines in both broadcast and print journalism. I will start with Rick Kaplan, who has toiled for both the network and for CNN, has won 4 DuPont Awards, 2 Gold Batons in that mix, and 34 Emmys, 3 Peabodys, 4 Overseas Press Awards. He was only 5'3" when he began this business, but lifting up the awards built him slowly, and spent the bulk of his career at ABC News, where he was executive producer of World News Tonight, Nightline, Primetime Live, which he may or may not want to admit he founded. But I'll ask a general question first. What are the constraints now in electronic journalism in covering news that seems serious in the 60s or the 70s?
There's a much greater, shouldn't be surprised to anyone, there's a much greater emphasis now on audience levels and keeping your demographics strong and bringing in your ad revenues, and there's just such an extraordinary pressure for profits and revenue that you now think twice, I believe, when you send crews, when you dedicate program time, not just from the standpoint of how much money am I going to expend, you want me to move this closer. No one's ever asked me to be louder before. So you have, on one hand, you have to weigh much more carefully the commitment of resources to a particular story because you're going to spend real money for it. But in a very real way now, and executive producers have been having to deal with this for a long time. Ob Weston probably took 2020 through more incarnations in order to take advantage of where he rightly thought the audience was interested and it kept the show successful. Now producers are sitting in there and they're wondering almost how, it's not to pander to the audience, but is this a story that's going to get me an audience return? And if it's not going to get me an audience return and I have a low rating that week, then I'm dead. And if I have too many low ratings and too many, then maybe we're all dead. And so there's a tremendous, tremendous pressure that affects now your editorial judgments in too many places. There's also a problem, I think, in the way journalists develop across the years. I was very lucky, and as I look out here, most of you were equally lucky, that we worked with great journalists. And the standards were very high, and you had a set of values, and you weren't as involved with the business side. And I remember working for years on the Cronkite Show and never had any idea what our ratings. I knew that at some point Walter became #1 and I knew we were in first. I never knew what the ratings were. The ratings were never published. I didn't even know what day the numbers came out. And now they know what the overnights, and producers know what the overnights are. They know what they just know too much about things that maybe should be secondary to them. And journalists, a lot of the people who are in charge of programs today, when you look at their backgrounds, because again, there's so many outlets, it's almost like the disintegration you see in the National Hockey League and in baseball. There's so many teams now and so many places to play that the quality of the players is not as high as it used to be. You look in journalism, there's so many shows and so many outlets and so many places, and you look at the resumes, I guess, of some of the executive producers, some of those people who make those decisions, and they may be great kids and they may be, have great potentials, but there's something lacking in their resumes, and a lot of it has to do with experience and the ability to say no and the ability to know when to say yes, and to take some brave steps at times, and too often that's not the case.
Let me ask one more question. When Roone Arledge came on the scene in news, he was greeted with all the enthusiasm the Romans had for Attila. Now they're building buildings with his name on it.
Rightfully.
What does that represent? What does that slow progress represent?
In the same way that CBS no way was going to let somebody like Ted Turner buy CBS and brought in their savior, Larry Tisch, to save CBS. In the same way Larry saved CBS for someone else, I guess. In Roon's case, I think people just jumped to the conclusion that some guy in sports, and they didn't know very much about, maybe they didn't know enough about what Roon had done, wasn't going to be up to the job of handling the news division. And in fact, Roon proved that he's probably the finest, not just news producer, but the finest news executive we've seen. And he was someone who knew that what was important and would spend for it. And he was not a spendthrift by any means, and he was very responsible about it, but I think in his own way he enjoyed having the reputation of being, Mr. Moneybags, because he wanted to make clear that when a story was worth covering, we were going to go after it. When a show was worth doing, we were going to do it. And I just think that people misjudged him at the beginning and came to realize by his actions that he built an extraordinary news division. The best.
When you mentioned the ratings,
And I was proud of Primetime Live that we did. least after
When you
a
mentioned the ratings, I was once beating up on Norman Lear over programming, and he took it very graciously for a time. We'd known each other a long time. They listen, I'll tell you when television began to go downhill. He said, I was then with the New York Times. He said it was when your goddamn paper started publishing the Nielsen ratings. And there's some truth, I think, in that, as the Fortune 500 and the lists do affect the way people respond, if they're going to be listed as number 1 or number 17 or...
I think it's when all of a sudden executives came to realize that great news organizations didn't just bring prestige to the table, which is, I think, what William Paley was after, but all of a sudden, news divisions could turn a profit, could make money. And in the experience of station... Another number, yeah, but a real important number, right. Even one that might have been held corporately. Right. And I think when they realized that news divisions could become money bags, it became a problem for news.
Jane Mayer, who is one of the best reporters working any beat in the U.S. these days, is a writer for the New Yorker, came from the Wall Street Journal, news side, and is author of 2 extraordinarily interesting books, one, Landslide, about the Iran-Contra affair, and one, Strange Justice, on the rise, the slow progress, continues to be slow, for Thomas. She also, within these walls and other places, is noted for a piece that she did on the new president of ABC News, David Weston, in relation to what is the significance of the rise of people like David Weston in the television news business?
I guess, I hope this is okay. I look at Weston as basically a symptom of some of the things that we've discussed here. He is, his background was as a lawyer. He was a very smart lawyer, a very successful one, but he had no background in news when he became the president of ABC News, which raised questions in my mind, and certainly in many of the people that worked over at ABC, about what the proper qualifications really are for somebody running a network news operation. To me, it would be like Harvard University is looking for a new president. It's unthinkable that they would, for instance, pick somebody who didn't have a graduate degree and some experience in academia. And so because of that choice and some of the problems they were having at ABC News, I spent some time interviewing people over there about what was going on at ABC News. I think I talked to 90 people by the time the piece was done. And I found it, I think it was in many ways disturbing, and mostly for the obsession that I kept finding, as you were discussing, with ratings. And I hadn't realized ratings are now, just as they are in politics, not just a matter even of overnights. What people have are minute-by-minute ratings in these news operations, and they can sit there and they can watch the little needle go up and down depending on, when there's something flashy said that the audience cares about, and when there's something maybe dull but important that they don't. And I think the temptation to sort of craft the news, to feed the ratings, to make the profits, to keep the giant conglomerates going, subverts the independent judgment often of very good news people. They're terrifically talented and smart people at all of these places that we're talking about, but they're constantly having those at war with the commercial needs. And we were talking about the role of ratings earlier in television and profits, and I remember reading quotes from Bill Paley saying that he didn't want his news operation to know what the ratings were, and in fact, he expected to lose money. And he said it's not that he was such a saint, as anybody who knows about Paley knows, but he said he hated to lose money, but he loved what it bought him. And what it bought him in the news division was prestige, so that when he put Beverly Hillbillies on the air, he felt that he could still, be a upstanding citizen. And it also bought him goodwill with the FCC at a time when that mattered.
In your piece on ABC, you pointed out, I'll ask Rick, or we can talk about it later, that primetime live coverage of the fall of the Berlin Wall had the second worst ratings of that season. Why do you think that was, and why did ABC think it was, and what did they do because of that?
I think that Bob McChesney was talking earlier about the problem of not having context. I have to think, as somebody who covered the fall of the Berlin Wall, I was there that night in Berlin, it was, for me, one of the most thrilling things I've ever seen. It's the reason you're a news person, is to see something like that. And if it doesn't work on television, I have to believe it's the inability of television in that instance to convey the context of what all of that meant. It's a fabulously interesting story. It was the end of an era. It was about the collision of two competing forms of government that were dividing the world. And if you can't make that interesting, then I have to think it's the problem with the way it was presented. Or also, if you can't get ratings, it doesn't matter, because it's important anyway.
We'll come back to it, and Rick can talk about it I want to introduce the man I've always thought was the best television critic in the country. I've always been amazed he could do it for so long. Marvin Kittman, who calls himself the executive producer of his commentary and criticism in Newsday, is also an author, best known, at least to me, as the writer of a very good book called George Washington's Expense Account. He followed that with The Making of the President, 1789. You can't judge a book by its cover, and then I Am ECR. But those credentials pale with the fact that I once hosted a television show together, which I am absolutely sure that no one in this room, perhaps any room, ever saw. I am from Jersey City. He is from Leonia, New Jersey, just across the river. And we did a show which ran on Channel 9 here for a time. I mean, I can't imagine they didn't take it off. Called The Jersey Side, which was supposed to give... It was the funniest show up in New Jersey up till The Sopranos. And then one day, television being what it is, they took us off the air. This is a quote. In fact, this is Kittman's Law. On the TV screen, pure drivel tends to drive off ordinary drivel. Where do you think non-fiction television, to put a fine point on it, is on the drivel scale these days?
Before I answer that question, I just wanted to, I agree absolutely with everything that's been said here today. But I'm not as optimistic about the future as everybody else is in television. And we'll get you're from Washington, and you know you don't have to answer questions directly. And first of all, I want to correct several. I know you're a distinguished journalist, but you made so many mistakes in the introduction to me that, in all fairness, I have to correct it. I did not write George Washington's expense account. I was only the co-author of that book. George Washington wrote his own expense account. And also the title of my book is The Making of the President, 1789, not President. The S and S's were reversed then. But none of the discussions going on here, I've listened to the opening address, I think none of them really go deep enough into what's wrong with television journalism, and particularly that's specialized. I blame what's happening, everything that was said, on TV itself. I blame it on Vladimir Zworykin for inventing TV news, which he did right after the scanner and the orthocon. The problem is that TV produces apathy in the viewer, and it makes people not care about anything. And these high standards we theoretically had at the beginning, or I'm not so sure they were that high. I remember when I started getting paid to watch television, which I never used to do until I got paid for. I remember that I found a lot to criticize back on December 7th, 1969, when I started a day that will live in infamy as far as the television networks are concerned. They weren't that high, but the apathy that television creates has made people not care about standards. And it's the people at home, of course, who were never really interested in standards to start with, became less interested. But an even more serious problem was the impact of the people watching television who then went to journalism, which I think probably David Weston is an example of this arrested development. When you grow up watching TV, it's a very contagious disease, and when you see all the things, all the standards starting to drop, that this affected the way the whole chain reaction took place. And the ones to blame least are the people at home. We're always the butt of everything. They're checking the audience levels and the demographics. And the whole concept is if we know what we're doing when we're watching television, when actually we don't. And we never really knew anything. I mean, at the height of radio's influence, I remember surveys showed that this was back in the 1940s, surveys showed that only 75% of the people knew the name of the President of the United States. And that was FDR, and this was in his 4th term. And the idea that they keep asking us, what do we want from news, which is the whole thrust and goes back to the drivel discussion, I mean, I think that's fallacious, because we don't know really what we want in the news. And in the old days, nobody ever asked us what we wanted, what we were interested in. They just presented the news. That's what was the news. And you didn't know in advance what was going to happen in the world. And this is a major mistake, a major problem with television, this exploring the audience. And if they would just go back, I mean, this whole Newsweek and news, to me, has created a lot of the drivel that we have in the way of news. And I think we have to go back to just telling us what the news is and not anticipating in advance.
A man named Dick Tuck ran for the Assembly in California and lost. and his concession speech, one of the shortest on record, but got to the points. Also, Mark's point, his concession speech was, "The people have spoken, the bastards." Going to the kind of line where Jane meets Rick, and the question of Jane saying that the presentation of news may have been the problem. Rick, is it possible? Rick could explain that, but is it possible that this medium just is not very good at meeting what we call, and we have basically always been print people, what we call news?
Well, after listening to Marvin, it's a little scary, and I'm thinking that I have to rethink my opinions, because I'm tending to agree with him, and there must be something wrong with that. No, you know what? I think it is a real big problem when you start to spend too much time wondering what the audience really wants out of a newscast, because I think it's perfectly proper to think what the audience wants out of a television program, your entertainment, or you're a mix of news and entertainment like a magazine show. I think that's perfectly proper to figure out what the audience is looking for, and you try to meet those expectations. I think with the news, I think it's a tremendous mistake to try to do that. On the Berlin Wall, which I'd correct you, it was actually the lowest rated program that Prime Live ever did. And I will tell you, and it's not because of any great production on our part, it's one of the most exciting primetime lives we ever did. It was a situation where, first, in terms of exclusivity, there was one live feed coming out of Berlin that night, up to that moment. NBC, I think, in live with Tom Brokaw, his half-hour newscast. And NBC Dateline had not yet sprouted in every night time slot there was. And so there was no other coverage of Berlin except for that one half hour on Tom Brokaw's Evening News. And NBC allowed us to use their satellite. Now I think it was sabotage that they let us do that, but they let us use their satellite. And here's the scene, if you don't remember it. People are on top of the wall, hammering it with sledgehammers. People are climbing over the wall. They're running. There's tens of thousands of people out there. We're there. The master shots from this area are the most unbelievable spectacles you have ever seen. We are with people as they're reuniting for the first time, in some cases for a quarter century, where they had not seen their family or their loved ones. It was the most amazing thing. And we'd sit there, and there's tearful reunions, and you know, you're sitting there and you're watching, you're wondering what the East German police are going to do, and some of them have disappeared, others are walking around, there's weapons. It was really quite amazing. And it's one of those things you can't miss.
So why did it get such poor ratings?
We talked about that a lot, and the only conclusion, well, no, because it's a real problem. You sit there and you think, my God, I've just put something on as exciting as Ben-Hur, and neither her or him are watching. And the only thing we could think of was what was missing, as opposed to when the Berlin Wall went up, is there was no dread. There was no threat. It's over. And in a way that only the American can get sometimes, hey, you know, we're not going to go to war over this. It's over. Wall's coming down. I see, yeah, all right, they're on top. It's Germans. It's not me. It's guys we fought in another war, right? I mean, it's just, there was no dread. There was no threat. There was no ominous anything. It was over. And people just didn't show an interest in it. And I will tell you, every single program, including Tom Brokaw's Evening News that night, every single program that did a show on the Berlin Wall that whole week had its lowest ratings of the period. And I think part of it, to speak to what Marvin said a moment ago, is that maybe we're unrealistic to think that we're going to produce a newscast that Americans are driven to watch when there's not a lot of news or they don't have particular interest. Because maybe if you're just a citizen, and we show in the low voter turnouts and the rest that citizens of this country don't really consider themselves, you know, guardians of the Constitution or the rest. They're happy to live in this country. They have a lot of expectations, and we tend to meet most of them in terms of what the government will do to protect them and the freedoms that they have. And they're busy with their families, and they're busy, you know, going to school and have a job and paying the bills and think they don't get mugged and all the rest of those things. And unless you do something to threaten that, I just don't have a whole lot of time or interest in it. And maybe that's just the attitude Americans have, and I know some news executives who think that they can attract the 25 to 39 audience to watch their news, but the only way you can do that is to, I think, subvert rules of traditional news values. I think that's the only way you can do that. But I think we have unreasonable expectations, perhaps, of the American public, which shouldn't change our mission or what we do, but maybe explains what some of the problems are.
But why should it matter that we're not interested in any one particular story? That's what I never quite grasped, because I grew up not being interested in anything. And I watched something...
You're very qualified for what you...
Yes. That is a major qualification. But then I would hear about something, hey, that's, gee, I didn't know about that, and your interest grows. But if I had to list the things I was interested in, as an audience member, I would have been only wanted to know about the Pittsburgh Pirates, for example. And maybe a couple of girls in the neighborhood, but so everything is
That'd
totally...
actually be important to a number of the shows that are on the air now.
They finally figured it out.
The whole concept is wrong. I mean, all the professionals are going in the wrong direction, like they've done so many things wrong with television news. Starting from the very beginning, they have picked up all these things from radio, for example. I mean, the whole concept of somebody reading an anchor is wrong. The whole concept of having superstar journalists, anchor people that you pay all this money to in television is wrong.
But they started, all those superstars earned that superstar. I mean, they started as, $100 a week guys and made their way and worth the money.
But when I look at television, I keep thinking television is a visual medium. How come, who can possibly name one cameraman? I mean, I've been at the job for 32 years. I don't know the name of any cameraman, anybody who's done great visual work. To me, the big money she paid for the pictures. And we do have occasionally great pictures, but the superstars are the correspondents. There are so many things wrong. The whole concept of Dan saying to Bob, what do you think? Well, Dan, I think. Bob, Richard, what do I think? Why do they keep naming names? For example, you have 22 minutes to give you the news, the world, and they're spending 4.5 minutes with names. Jane, what are you thinking about that? Rick, what do you think?
I think the reason
So wrong.
What do you think,
I mean,
Jane?
what
do you think, Jane?
I think that the reasons for all of these things is basically it's part of branding, which is so much of what the media is right now. And the big names are the brand, and you turn on the brand to see your big name deliver the news. And it's all part of, again, the commercialization process. And
that's why we're in so much
If
trouble.
you have 700 outlets, your brand becomes very important, because if somebody has all the, it's not, Marvin, in your day you had like 2 choices, right? Keep the lights off or listen to the radio.
Right. Now, you
or
talk
both,
about
actually.
the problems with branding. Your network had
Which one of my networks?
CNN. I mean, had a gentleman named Bernie Shaw, whose great moment in journalism was being under the bed in Baghdad, and never quite matched that. Now, because of this branding, he became a superstar. I hope he's not here now.
Yeah, I would. Bernie had a very distinguished career in journalism. He probably asked the best question ever asked at a presidential debate.
That's right. The best question, right. I remember the Dukakis question. But the branding is the major problem. I rest.
You're going to rest? No.
We work together.
Are
you retiring?
You're wrong, though, on, and I think that this, and I think it's a fundamental problem, yes. There is, because television did not evolve from radio. All news, radio was the reading of print news. It evolved from print standards, and we have, 3 of us here work primarily in print. We've managed to hold the first radio and then television to our standard, I think, in a remarkably effective way. Yes, we have lost, but in fact, they still look, Rick may totally disagree with this, it seems to me that television, as does radio, still look for prints imprimatur for what they do, because we define what news is, and the question is, should we?
But Richard, to go back to the Berlin Wall, and where print and television, I think, have diverged, is that Berlin Wall lesson. Basically, you know more about this than I do, but taught the networks that foreign news is boring. And they've been cutting and cutting and cutting when it comes to covering the rest of the world. Equalization brings us closer, and there's now at ABC a London bureau that has to cover everything from Moscow to Africa. How can they make news interesting if they've got that big a territory to cover? They're going to just be reactive. They're going to parachute in. They're going to cover something that the newspapers have already covered, get 2 pictures, and leave. And they're not going to be able to take the fall of the Berlin Wall, where I had a wonderful editor, Jim Stewart, who teaches here sometimes, and he had a million ideas of how to make that story interesting. He said, go find where they're giving the drugs to the athletes in the Olympics in East Germany, and see what's going to happen to them. Go to the bookstores and see what these people want to read for the first time they've got a choice. Go to the state police and see what happens when they open the files in the neighborhoods where the Stasi have been keeping records and neighbors have been ratting out neighbors. I mean, these were great stories, and it took, I was lucky to have such a good editor with a great imagination, but you can't do that if you've got to cover Moscow to Africa.
Well, Jim is certainly a wonderful editor, but I would argue, I'll ask Rick, I think there's more foreign coverage on television now than ever. However, it is not what we call news. It's business coverage. The largest news organization in this country, and the one with the most foreign bureaus by a factor of almost 10, is Bloomberg. The Bloomberg has more than 10 times as many foreign correspondents out there as does the New York Times, and its only rival really is Reuters. So I think the point that Professor Chen made, which I see in the printers, I don't know who's in the room, but the triumph, I became a political reporter because that's where the action was. Who got to be well known? Who got the most money? Who got the girls in Jersey? They were me. Because you didn't want to cover politics. That's where the action was.
Wouldn't have mattered.
And in those days, the guys with drinking problems or other kind of problems were sent to business news, or if they were women, to the women's pages. Who gets lecture fees? Who gets the lecture fees now? Economic reporters. So that, there has been a change that Reagan, the romance of business, I think has changed. Am I totally wrong?
I think there's far less international coverage on television now than ever, and I think it all has to do with what editors perceive to be what Americans are interested in. But I would also tell you, before you celebrate print too much, that if you talk to a number of people who work at the major newspapers, their opportunity to file a think piece or to go off and spend a month in Africa or to do those kinds of great pieces that you used to see in the Tribune magazines and the New York Times magazines and all the Sunday supplement magazines or on the front page of the regular newspapers, those are becoming more and more scarce. Less time, less revenue, and fewer resources are being devoted to those kinds of endeavors. I think it really may come back to what Marvin, frankly, was talking about in a joking way but serious, which is that if you're a journalist, you're supposed to go into it, and it's kind of like if doctors used our philosophy then, or would go the way journalism has gone, then they would sit there and say, this guy doesn't want to know he has cancer, so I'm not going to tell him. And it's that kind of attitude. Journalists need to go into things and say, this is what Americans should know, need to know. You have to set standards. Hopefully they're high standards. And that's you make your story choices when you start to wonder if, well, I don't think they care about Kosovo, or I don't think they care about East Timor, or I don't think they care what the story is. Labor issues. I think Professor McChesney was exactly right. Until we get to the point where if 50,000 still works, rampage through the streets area, and 12 people die, so we cover it for a day. Until that happens, I think there are a lot of great stories that, frankly, don't get covered because somebody has decided that it won't sell. Now, the real tragedy by minute rating, and I have times have asked for Nielsen to send me a minute-by-minute rating, is you sit there. Actually, I learned this from a piece that Av Weston's 2020 did. Rodney Dangerfield would record every one of his comedy bits. 35 minutes, and he would sit with a lead. Every time there wasn't a laugh, every minute, he would, mark on no laugh, no laugh. And he'd find out what joke wasn't getting a laugh and kill those jokes and insert into position 17 or 21 or 35 another joke. Maybe that way it'll be wall-to-wall laughter. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. It's in magazines, news shows. It's, they sit there and they say, "Why did the audience dump her? What was there?" And they look, "Oh, with the stock report." If they want business news, they ought to go to CNBC or CNN FN if you have it on your cable, which is doubtful. And you start to go minute by minute and determine that with the audience up there, then that's the story you don't want to do too much of. Those stories generally win the DuPonts, by the way, and that's what happens.
Rick, this is Marvin here. There was a program in the 1980s called Max Headroom, a story, I think, really great journalistic series. Max worked for the 23rd Network, and they used to do minute-by-minute ratings, and then they would actually cancel shows minute-by-minute. I think that might be a good idea. If somebody's discussing something gets a bad rating, it could be sort of a trapdoor. He could suddenly disappear from the screen. Richard, this is Marvin here. I agree with you that print is the medium of the future. However, there's one problem going on within print. The new generation of print people, the editors especially, have grown up watching television and television news, and their concepts of what is news is being skewed from this warped development. And they tend to agree now. I've seen this happen in my career, and how, as a critic, and to see how, when I started, newspapers had separate news judgment, something that was, a standard, and people in television would look to see what the newspapers do, mostly to their stories. But now they have converged, the newspaper editors and the television, and they cover the same story, and they go crazy over the same things. There's no balance that we used to have. And I just want to say before this, and I have this here, that the thing that bothers me most about television news is the way they scare people. There seems to be the thrust is not to inform but to scare. So I watched the storm warnings, for example, as if this was anything new. There should be a northeaster heading our way, and there was such a barrage of scary stories about it in this northeast here. And or whatever happened to El Nino? I mean, Dan Rather, every night he was into that story, as if it was something new in the history of mankind. And they have these mini-series on the latest in phobias that would go on for a whole week.
There is some new, by the way. About
Weather?
In 1938, a hurricane went through Long Island and across New England, killed hundreds of people, destroyed whole towns. The simple reason being, no one knew it was coming. Today, the whole idea that you would know in bar on the East Coast that a storm is coming is totally new. It's a gift of electronics. No one knew hurricanes were coming in the old days. How would you know? Jane?
All I was going to say is
I never heard you so quiet. I'm so proud.
Marvin, I'm not sure that I agree that the print is really taking its cues from TV news. And in fact, one of the things I learned when I was maybe, but one of the things I learned when I was doing the piece about ABC was how the viewership seems to be changing, and they're losing a lot of the sort of elite opinion maker kinds of viewers, getting what Ed Fooey, who was the former Washington bureau chief of ABC, called I'm sorry to say, the trailer park crowd, which is how he put it. But I found in talking to a lot of people and a lot of other journalists, that they don't really tune in now for the evening news the way they used to tune in. And not as much I used to say. People partly are just working longer hours, so, they're not home at 6:30 or 7 to be watching the national news. They're usually in the office trying to finish up their own work day. And so I'm not sure that it packs the same wallop that it did, but maybe you disagree.
Well, it's not, but there's such a small number of people watching all three evening newses anyways. I mean, we're talking about a combined total of something like 24 rating points, which is not a whole lot of people. So the idea, evening news is net.
What is 24? That 24?
I don't know. That's what is about 30 million people, something like that. 30 million people. The evening news has never been on at a good time for people, working people. Most people have been at their jobs far longer than that. It used to take longer to get home and you're outboard. But I think what's happened is that evening news, in an attempt to gather a larger, stronger demographic of younger viewers, has taken the traditional evening news subject matter and changed it so that they have more of these magazine-type pieces in the evening news that are not news, and it does take a serious new viewer for a minute to figure out that once the anchor says, and now in our Eye on the World report, that's it, and the news is over and I leave, and sometimes that happens 9 minutes into the show. I think it was right that a number of executive producers took a look at the news budgets that they had, both at the show and ABC, and they said, we can do these packages better. We can get people, we can hear, we can tell stories better, we can report the news in a more interesting way, but we weren't going to mess with what the news was. We were just going to try to report it in a more interesting, thorough, substantive way. The context would be there. At some point, that changed. And, I mean, in one situation, you had this, ABC's World News Tonight, which was the highest-rated evening news program, to become envious of Tom Brokaw's younger audience, but Tom Brokaw was second place by quite a bit. And he kind of went their way a little bit. It, I think, irritated the hard news audience that Peter had owned, and the audience that Tom got was never going to be satisfied with Peter being a little softer, that kind of thing. So he kind of hurt his own audience. It helped. Then he went to Dan. The point is, evening news has softened up, and evening news has redefined news for itself. And I think has gone away from the traditional news values that serious news viewers want.
I think there's been so much emphasis on production values in news that is totally the wrong way to go. I mean, I'm beginning to wonder how it was ever possible for me to get so involved in Ed Morrow standing on the rooftop during the London Blitz. I mean, maybe in the studio from Madison Avenue, for all we know, there's just too much this soft, medium soft. It's like they're talking about pretzels.
You didn't have a lot of television competition when Ed Murrow was doing that.
That was in radio.
Right.
Before.
Go ahead.
It's interesting that some of the stories that have become national obsessions really are not very produced. I mean, watching O.J. in his car going on the L.A. freeways, I mean, there was nothing packaged or even interesting about it, watching one car working its way through. And the same with...
But the Berlin Wall didn't have, because we didn't know if O.J. was going to blow trains out and was going to, so there was this...
O.J. should have been on the Berlin Wall.
But the election recount, I mean,
program.
The two principles. Does watching television, in fact, have any impact on what is on television?
I don't think I do.
Well, speak for yourself, Jane. 5 of the programs I've praised this season have already gone on air. That is power. Negative power.
You are the Dr. Kevorkian of media criticism.
As someone who's had to read Marvin at his best and worst, and as someone who's read, what generally, I think, television journalists in the room who may disagree or agree, what happens when you read these pieces, these criticisms and these critiques on is, you get pissed because, how could they say this and how could they say that? And oh God, they came in here with their opinion, just wrote to prove it. He's trying to be clever. What happens though is, if there's reasonable criticism or decent criticism, you might not admit it to a colleague, but maybe it'll have an impact on you. Most of the time, though, the stuff is written off as, wasn't that funny, wasn't that, am I not reporting about me or writing about me? I'm glad she's not profiling that.
The people who want to ask questions should set themselves up, and I'll ask a last. I want to make a comment on something that Marvin said with my things. That when I was very taken by the point, after all the people now doing else, in fact, grew up watching television. I mean, it really does. In some, it's more a medium, more an environment than it is a medium. Television is where we live. While people are getting ready, Rick, if there had been no newspapers, there had been no radio. I know this brings up a certain recent unpleasantness, but if you had no constraints on you and they gave you your own channel and said, make it news, what would you do?
I have no idea. I know that...
An honest
well, I have no idea. I mean, I know that what impacted me was watching Edward R. Murrow and studying about that era and listening to their radio reports and coming to CBS at a marvelous time when Murrow's people were still around and the great producers were still around and Huntley Brinkley was still on the air, and there were real standards and things to shoot for, and that was a lesson. See, my concern now is if you watch, if I was growing up today, and the problem that Marvin leads is that, all right, so you're looking at what the media is today, what are you learning? When I was growing up and learning, I was watching Huntley Brinkley and the CBS Evening News. That's what I was watching. And I was reading one of 7 Chicago daily papers or more, and at some point, good New York papers. And so that was kind of my grounding, and so that's maybe why I believe what I believe about news. But if you're growing up today, you're watching... maybe you're growing up watching the Fox network, and you'll grow up in Rupert Murdoch's news, or no, but it's just different. My environment was different, and so if I didn't have all that traditional news as the example of what should be, I fear what I might have done.
We should turn it over to, forgive the term, the audience.
My name is Ned Sherman. I'm another one of those out-of-work comic skulls who had a media series on the air for a few years. And I would like to, at the outset, tell Rick Kaplan that there were some of us who believed that the Berlin Wall story was aggressively ever time to. And I remember it vividly, and a lot of my friends did as well. And also I'd like to say that I'm here with a young woman this morning who's one of my interns who was on the other side of that wall on the night in question, and reunited with her man, Natalia Kursk, who's sitting right over here. Natalia, get from him so that people can see you. And I would also like to say that I'm one of the many people who wrote Marvin Kittner's columns and enjoyed doing it very much. I also have a little story about Marvin and why I'm where I'm at now, a new one in, I hope, years from now. Our series was quite successful. Marvin wrote periodically about how good it was, and GE was my funder. And when GE found out that Marvin thought this was a good show, they got the ground out from under me, and that was the end of the funding. But getting to the more serious aspects of where network news is, forget local news. I see they're coming up later, and we can have some fun with them. News, if you watch network programs today, the question is, why isn't there more news and less features? ABC News on a given night will have at least 4 feature stories. NBC isn't far behind, and CBS doesn't know what it's doing anymore, so it's hard to figure out what to do. Why is it so motivating about stories about prickly diseases or something that, other than the fact that there are remarkable stories that go uncovered every day. Why isn't there some unearthing of news stories?
I'm sure Rick has it, but
I think what you've got is, again, as news audiences shrink for whatever reason that is, either because of the hour they're on or the fact that there are so many more choices now that there's just a lot of competition for eyeballs. I think that is for me is if the audience is going out, but it's a younger audience, your ad department can sell it for more money, and so it kind of balances out. Lower audience, higher demographics. You can keep the revenue stream healthy. And some people believe the way to attract that younger audience is with features. And I'm not totally opposed to features. I just think there's a lot of important news that falls away that traditionally in the past would have been covered.
Last line for me, and it's just this, it's that don't you think there's a seepage of the dreadful local news invading the national news programs at this time? Martin, what would you say to that?
Well, I think that's a very serious problem, that localism. We've seen this news you can use philosophy, which, as far as I was able to see, Gordon's order introduced into CBS News, as the criteria, which comes directly from local news, which these sweep stories and how to run the news viewer, whether super rats are invading your city or salad bars can kill you, or the latest in phobias for a week. And I think that you get more and more in network news. The big problem with features is that people don't, after a while, and it's happened already, they can't tell the difference between features and news. And they watch, for example, local news and certain news of having a network's program featured on the news. And I remember Live at 5 in New York during the Gordy Saturday Night Live. Every week they had Who's Going to Be on Saturday Night Live as a news feature. So Saturday Night Live was a part of the news like sports and weather every week. And you see it now with the Survivor on CBS. They put that hard news if you get one of the survivors from the Survivors. And CBS, that was their major achievement this past decade. In
So
news.
from See It Now to Survivor.
Right.
From CNN, Rick Kaplan. Is there anything you wish you'd done differently during your tenure at CNN? And do you have any thoughts about where CNN might be going under the AOL merger?
It's a very tempting set of questions, and I would just ask. Basically, because CNN's going through a very tough transition. I had felt before I came to CNN, I'm pleased that I went to CNN, and I'm proud of what we did at CNN. They're going through a very tough period right now, and just assume let them do what they do with their product, and then I'll probably have something to say about it.
But they've already done stuff with their product, no? Is that too
Well, it's kind of like the third inning, and I grew up in Chicago where we don't play fall baseball, but I'm worried about the third inning and not enough. So I just assume let the game play a little longer.
This gentleman here.
My name is Jesse Cafino Greenberg. I hope this doesn't sound too much like a diatribe, but whenever I hear people speak who are particularly distinguished and interested in given media, they speak about its decline in general. You hear people in conservatories talk about the decline of Western music, totally ignoring jazz, or you hear people speak about the decline of the English language, totally ignoring regionalisms and the acceptance of slang. As somebody who gets a lot of content online, you seem to have totally passed over that, particularly in its interaction with television news media. I watch Media Aware, I watch CNN, I think they're perfectly decent news programs with great content. I think the networks are falling behind, that it might be shown in the thing. I don't think going a particularly significant sector of the new news media content.
I'll start by saying, frankly, as far as I can see, at the moment the internet is a print medium. and it's turning out to save a lot of print journalism operations. But what it does do is speed delivery of information, which then changes the other media around. The story I was thinking of the story of the Berlin Wall, and the fact that when it fell, we were alive. When it went up in 1961, and for those who knew Berlin in those times, there was a cafe, I think it was called the Alba, right by Checkpoint Charlie. And Dan Shore that night in 1961 was there with a crew. And they were sitting there late at night having coffee when suddenly lights went up. Klieg lights went up all around them. And it was the East Germans coming to lay the barbed wire, which then built into the wall. Obviously, Shore and the crew, and crews had to carry a lot more weight in those days, went running down past the checkpoint and filmed the beginning of the Berlin Wall being put up. One difference between then and now, though, and the Internet, now, that film was not for more than 2 days, because if they had to get that film to the United States in time for the CBS Evening News 2 days later, so that today we live with instantaneous transmission of information, which changes everything, not only journalism, or not only encrusted journalism, but it changes politics. I mean, the power of the president or of other politicians has always been rooted in what the people know, and when they know it, they can try to control the flow of information. Now you can't control.
Of course, the difference would be that no network would have had a correspondent unless we were there serendipitously having coffee at that place, because the correspondent would have been in London, booking a flight to Zimbabwe.
Right.
But
Except for the Bloomberg guy would have been there trying to figure out what it meant to the market.
Yeah, but he would have had so many numbers all around him, he shouldn't have seen the wall anyway.
I was going to say, I mean, there are great new, media, and they haven't really come into their own yet on the net. And CNN does do a great job. Nobody would debate that. I think what you don't get when you're looking at the news world now is a sense of what it's like when there was time to think, time to report, time to you really get behind the public relations machinery that's coming into your face, and you lose a lot when you can't have put that effort into it. And that's what's disappearing sometimes.
You also don't get ink on your fingers from the internet.
What it was like when there was time is a definition of youth, and goes to his question about those of us who are caught in the past. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Prue Clark. I'm at the Journalism School, and I'm also a journalist with the Public Broadcasting Network, 14 bureaus around the world. And my point in saying that is that I would really like to hear you explain why the standards in television news are so different here compared with other countries. Is it that American television viewers don't want the same standards that they want in other countries?
I think we should handle that question. No one's brought up here, the young man brought up the internet, but the fact is, of course, in this city, as long as you give Time Warner, I guess now, the Dolan family, money came to D.C., to Macau, Amman, Beijing every night, and see that. Not many people do it, obviously. But why are our standards?
Well, I think it's been the nature of Americans, get somebody out of the history department to come up here and be more specific, but I think that it's occasionally been the nature of Americans to be more interested in what's going on in their 50 states and less interested in the rest of the world. Not to say that there isn't an enormous number of people who are very interested in what's going on in the rest of the world. We're not as outward-looking, perhaps, as you might be in Australia or Europe. Maybe Europe has had to deal with more countries over the years on a regular basis in a very critical way than we have. It's just been maybe the nature, but the reality is that people who run news operations now believe, through polling, that Americans just don't care about all those stories overseas as much as they care about phobias and the rest. I'll tell you that when I was working at WBBM as a assignment desk person in 1969, or 1970, there was a study. They brought in the Magnet Associates, who was a group who was going to revolutionize, and did, I guess, local and network news. So they came in and they gave us a list of stories from 1 to 10 that dealt with people's people's interest in those stories. And number 10, or number 1, was politics. And what you wanted to do was cover nothing at the top of the scale, everything at the bottom. So you didn't want to cover politics. And this was Chicago, and Richard Daley was the mayor. And our news director, who was a coward, looked at me and said, well, don't send a crew to today's news conference. It's like, I'm too young to die. I mean, I am not going to not cover Richard J. Daley's news conference. And John Lane was the bureau chief upstairs, and he said, you're not going to what? Because he didn't send a network crew to it, figuring, well, they're the local. I mean, of course we're going to cover Richard J. Daley's news conference. And there was just a furor in the newsroom because Meg's list of what viewers wanted was not at all what Chicagoans wanted. And so I guess that, I don't have a lot of confidence in somebody telling me what Americans really want, but I also don't think that should be the criteria for a hard news program. I believe it's a criteria if you're doing kind of info news or some of the magazine shows and the rest you want to play, but I don't think, I really have a problem with it, working its way into the evening newses and the news part of morning shows. I don't think the morning shows are irresponsible because they throw some of that, culture into their program.
I agree with Rick that I think the Maggot organization and all the others like that should actually be outlawed, being against the public's interest. But I also think that we have to reach a point where we should stop being interested in what the public is interested in, just report news, whatever content it's on. And how do they know that people are not really interested in stories until they see the story, and not just once? Just like the show, it gets a big rating the first week. They've decided that people don't like that program, but it takes time, and to sometimes, if you haven't seen something, and we're at the point now where we haven't seen foreign news to any real extent except by watching the ITN News and the BBC News, which I find fascinating because they'll spend 4 minutes on a story about Algeria, an area that I know nothing about, and it's fascinating to me. But when it's try hard news, it doesn't get good rating, and immediately they cancel it, like we're going to hear about the Chicago station. I mean, it's like something totally new. The American people today, when you ask them, do you watch the news? I mean, I've had experience watching the news. They say, oh, yes, I watch Entertainment Night every night. And they think that that's news.
Well, that was brilliant. A former editor of the Herald Tribune, which has been praised here, really invented that by telling them when Entertainment Tonight was not particularly popular at first, his advice to them, make what you think it is, and it better not to be true.
Now,
Sir?
This goes way, way back when I was a teenager. All the networks covered the Kefauver hearings, remember Frank Costello's hands? And then you also had the Army McCarthy hearings. Right. Now, they canceled all the programs to show that. Now, what happened to these? They did that again with the Congress hearings. Remember that? All the programs were canceled. And then you had the impeachment hearings, sessions. Now, that's interesting that the networks did go back to that type of coverage. And they canceled all of their programs because they thought the public was interested.
No, but they knew that the cable networks, the 24 cable network, which would function almost as a video wire service through most of the day, they knew they would cover those. And even a story people were interested in, because it carries no commercials in it, it was real tough to break away from, the impeachment hearing. I got a note in the middle of there was a day, there was Saturday morning, when Livingston resigned, surprisingly, and the congressman, he was going to be the Speaker of the House, and we were also bombing that moment. I think we were bombing Baghdad. We were live, and we were live with the bombs in Baghdad, and we were live with the bombshell on the Hill, and I went upstairs to get a bottle of water real quick, and there was a note from someone who shall remain nameless who said, this isn't PBS, you could get in a commercial. Yeah. And I said, I went to that person, and it was right as it was right during Livingston. I said, I'm breaking for a commercial. To him, and he went nuts. And I said, well, I got this memo from you, and he just hung up on me. But I mean, it's just...
Yeah, but during the hearings and during the Army McCarthy, there was cable.
understand,
Yeah.
but life has changed, so
Of
we
course.
can, they don't have to do that anymore.
Exactly. All right, thank you.
I'm Jan Lignito. I'm an independent documentary producer. Two-part question. First part for Rick. Rick, I'm wondering, given the fact that we've seen the largest consolidation of power in hands of now 6 multinational companies in broadcasting, well ahead of Ben Bagdikian's predictions of 10 years ago, what you see as the prognosis for change? What do you think it's going to be the convergence of digital technologies and broadcast quality picture on the internet? Anything else? Second part of the question is for newspaper journalists, why you think the criticism of television news has disappeared from newspapers as a news story, not as a broadcast industry story. I remember with CBS, there was not a month that went by where there was not a story about in which we were raked over the coals for not having enough documentaries on, for this and that transgression. It seems to me that newspapers have a made part in what happened to television news by their conspicuous lack of criticism off the editorial page and outside of columns.
I'm just going to be brief and answer a piece of the first part of that question, which could take up an entire conference. You know, the danger, the concerns that we have about mega mergers and the rest. In the case of AOL Time Warner, you have some very credible, I think, good people who are running these companies and who told FCC, and that's all well and good. And then I sit there and say, well, that's fine, I guess, for that company, and we'll see how that plays out, and why speculate now. But what that does, and Professor McChesney got to that before, is, so if that sets the standard, and what if the next next duo that comes up isn't a Jerry Levin, there's not a Jerry Levin in the next group. Let's say that the next group is a Murdoch and who knows who. All of a sudden the precedent is set. You can't stop this group because you just don't like the guy running it, or when I mean, it's just, it is daunting. That much power in those two hands, and, you know, what if the next group isn't quite as benevolent? And what if the next group doesn't care about what we do as much? Or what if this group turns out not to care as much as they say? I mean, it's a little scary. It's not a competition.
But you see that the Justice Department is going after Microsoft in an antitrust suit, which is essentially about an operating system, when you now have the greatest consolidation of power over content in the history of the world.
I'm sure President Bush will clear that up.
He's worried.
As for the criticism of television, you know, I'm not sure I completely agree with the premise. I think when Leonardo DiCaprio was sent by ABC to interview the president, there was it was all hell broke loose, basically, and for weeks, not even for days.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the criticism of television, the content and direction of television news as a news story, as opposed to a business story or a celebrity story.
But it was a content question. It's about, who is a journalist today? And same, I did a piece recently about how John Ellis, who is George W. Bush's first cousin, making the call on Fox Network for, he was the person who decided that Florida had gone to Bush on election night. And that story, it was like the Manhattan phone book after that. So I think there is still a lot of interest in it, but news for print, just as for anybody else, is what you don't expect. And I think as standards kind of keep falling, it becomes less and less surprising to see that the marketplace is driving news values into the more and more sort of cheesy and commercial on the networks. So yet I still think that maybe there'll be new niche markets that will open up for better stuff.
I'm directly on the firing line regarding a question.
No, off columns and off the editorial page. I'm talking about specifically as news stories, not coverage, and not, as Ms. Mayer indicated, the coverage of events. I'm talking about why is there no coverage as news for the disappearance of documentary as a form.
Well, that's the bailiwick of the critic more than a news story. But I just wanted to say that I happen to thought that Leonardo would have been an interesting interviewer of the president because he might have had a fresh view. The reason we don't keep writing about that in 3 years, I've done that story around 93 times already, that, you know, what's happened to documentaries and where is it going? I mean, it's like they don't listen, and it's such a hopeless thing already to keep that point. More documentaries, like ABC invented the concept of having 3 hours on education, you know, which is a great idea, except it was 3 hours on the same night. And then as a result, got a low rating, ergo got the public's interest in education or documentaries. So every time you tell them something, they then use it to stick the knife into themselves.
We will go. Ob can answer the documentary question, too. For those who don't know him, the Ob Weston, mentioned here a couple of times, is the question.
I want to say Jane, but I know that the subject of this panel was setting a national example, and I want to commend the panel because it seems to me they hit all the right notes. There are a couple things I get here. First of all, minute-to-minute ratings. One of the elements that I discovered is that they are used to keep blacks off the air. It's the hidden secret, the dark secret of a network at the moment, and I really think that that's an undercovered story. In terms of setting a national example, I'd like to make this point. I think Rick was right. We are on a downward slope. The men who are now taking over in the business got their training in the last decade. In the last decade in television, the business of television news became the business of television news. And the bottom line has trumped the journalistic line every single time. The result of that is, first of all, you cut the size of your staff. That's obvious both at network and local stations. Second, you pay those people less money, which means that in many cases the best and the brightest no longer go there. And the third thing is you go down market fee, and that really. Now the people who are taking over, I fear, got their training in the last 10 years. They weren't mentored as Rick Kaplan was by people like Cronkite, as I was by Fred Friendly. The individuals now who are not exposed, have not been exposed to anything other than ratings. And that's just a summary of some findings that I came up with. It really isn't a question. I had a lot of questions, but you answered all quite well.
I have a question for you. How do the minute-by-minute ratings result in taking blacks off the air?
Because what happens is that they look at the minute-by-minutes and they see that, this is on the news magazines particularly, they see that, as some executives told me, blacks don't give us good demos. That's a shorthand for saying we will not do stories which do not deliver the demographics we are looking for on Dateline, on 2020, even at some of CBS programs. And this comes from the staff. I did the same thing you did, Jane. I talked to 125 people promising them anonymity, and in exchange for that got candor. And the folks who make the decisions confess that is what they do. So that way you don't see stories about blacks as much as you should, and why stories that are approved sit on the shelf for a long, long time until they get moss on them and essentially die. Now that's happened principally in the last decade, in an accelerating way.
The young lady over here.
Yes, my name is Kaomi Getz. I'm a student here. About the issue of planning news coverage, depending upon what we think the public wants and who the public is, accurately can we rely on ratings and polls to tell us, to answer those questions? Because, and then also, how much in newsrooms today is there kind of a snobbery on what demographics want to watch or listen to? My own unscientific goal is that I've talked to many cab drivers and truck drivers who listen to the BBC World Service every night, and just had a question about that.
I would take part of the question on research, going to watch or whatnot. My own experience, not so much of it in television, and you could do a whole panel or course on this, the effect of survey research on the society and on decision-making. Everyone from local station managers to the radio states use survey research in making decisions. And it doesn't matter whether the polling is right or wrong. It matters that it's there and people can cover themselves in making decisions. If there is some boss above them, and the boss above the president, why do that? The numbers made, look at numbers. And I think that that's simply been something that's developed over the last 20, 30 years in the U.S., that people are willing to accept those numbers because it covers their butts if things go wrong. Well, look at the second question, I got carried away.
Well, it's kind of related. I mean, just how accurate are those numbers? I mean, how do we really...
It doesn't, I would argue it doesn't matter whether they're accurate or not. People are going to make decisions. People spent the money to have the poll done. They're going to make decisions based on that. They didn't waste the money, and to show their bosses they had a reason to do it. Sure.
My name is George Strait. I currently work for a little company out in California. I used to work for a larger company here in New York, ABC, and work with it under. And what we heard from Professor McChesney actually was hired by OB, which shows you how smart OB was. What we heard from Professor McChesney this morning, I think, underscores, if you take a look at the context of the discussion this morning, something these days, in this decade and probably in the last decade too, more and more journalists move as one. It's packed journalism, and the packed journalism today has been about how terrible television news is. And what I'd like to do is sort of step aside and argue that the television news isn't as bad as we have heard today. Frankly, I think that the problems in news and in television news are serious problems, and I don't know that the seriousness of these problems is elucidated by people ad hominem attacks on people that they don't know, and sort of fall into the whole thing of, well, let's be funny rather than erudite, and I don't know that serves any of our purposes here. I think that the institution and these are very serious and can be approached in a very serious manner. But I do have a question about the new medium, and that is, and it really underscores trust. All of the surveys will tell you that the public has less trust for what we journalists do. And Professor Chase on the 19th century, we had a lot of newspapers. Well, you've got that now in the 21st century. It's the internet. Anybody with a computer can get on, and it's not news anymore. It's called content. So my question is, maybe Rick can do it because you involved more of the anyone else. And that is, how is it going to affect the trust of the readers and viewers of mainstream media when they are able to go to the internet and read things that may be wrong, but they can't wait for it to be voted or any qualifications thereof?
I find that actually the most terrifying aspect of the internet and the new media. I've gone to a number of conferences over the last year or so where internet folks get together, and one of the more frightening conferences dealt with who's responsible for the internet, who's responsible for what the control. And I sat with a group of people, and there's a gentleman who was sitting to my right at that conference, and he had a successful website, and what he was in the business of doing was publishing government documents, and actually it's been successful in the last couple of months. But the point was, he said, and we really did a public service. We published a list of pedophiles. And we even, we saved a family, we saved a community, a bunch of kids with this guy's birthday party. And I turned to him and I said, my God, what kind of resources did you have to check all the names, that are on that list? He said, well, we didn't have to check the names. The government gave us the names. These are the pedophiles. So I said, and you took their word, because they said you didn't have any responsibility for printing the names merely on the internet so everyone could see it? He said, no, it's the government's responsibility. And then I realized as the audience, here you get one murmur and there we got a different one, they all agreed with him. And I do not like forever make the government's made across the year. I wouldn't have to come to this conference again. And I find that, and it's even down to the newsrooms, by the way, when you look at the side that's doing the websites and you look at the side that does television, if you're going to get on CBS, ABC, Evening News, you're going to an editor, a writer, people who have to look at it as to pass their muster, and it gets on the air. That same story will get on the air if one person approves it on the internet. The level of checking, the level of, and the whole idea of validating this story or deciding whether something's bona fide, it just doesn't exist on the internet to an acceptable degree. I am greatly concerned that all those people who go to the internet, you won't know who's funding it, but more than that, things are written as gospel, and by no means is that assured. And so I'm very concerned about credibility on the internet, even in the traditional news organizations that have websites, because they don't, at this moment, they don't spend the same degree of energy and resources in checking what they put on their website as they do and what they put on the air.
Should we take one more? All right.
Thank you. Carl Gottlieb, Project for Excellence in Journalism. We're a Washington-based think tank of the university. I think everybody danced around an issue here as to why, in part, journalism is possibly so bad today. I'm not sure I agree with that. And that's money. That's profit, everything driven by profit or the quest for profit. What's the solution? What would you do? Would you end that profit in media? I mean, I look at this panel, it's a great panel, but you all either work for or have worked for very large companies. Mr. Kipman, your company was just purchased by a company. Newsday, I guess, is involved in Synergy.
Are you referring to the Tribune, which is a Ma and Pa operation?
Yeah, I worked for that Ma and Pa organization for 17 years, and big Ma and Pa. Do we do away with profits? If so, how do we finance coverage?
Well, let me just take the first crack at it. The basic problem is when it all started, news was considered a part of the obligations you had, the companies had, in exchange for the use of the public's airwaves, and then the concept that money made from news was introduced, the great breakthrough. But this was like the equivalent of the pizza parlor deciding to charge extra for the cardboard that's pizza. So that's the basic problem.
In fact, I think I read that when General Sarnoff was in the early days of television, he thought that the money in television was going to be made simply on selling the boxes, and that was the whole was going to be structured. I like maybe it's naive. I like to think that good work will find an audience. They're good books, they're good magazines, they're good papers like the Wall Street Journal. They're very profitable. I think maybe you'll find the messages that the TV is paying for, particularly if there's competition. It used to make more money when there was no competition. But what's today a great news show at 10 o'clock wouldn't make money with a smaller audience. I think that maybe they need to rethink some of the assumptions that they've got on their business model.
Well, go ahead, Ray.
Well, I think Jane's exactly right. I think that, first of all, good work will find its audience, and networks are going to become more interested in, or they're going to redo their business model so that, just like in radio where a 4 or 5 shares, everything, I think as audiences get smaller, I think good quality journalism will find air. CNN has 1/10 the audience of a network, of a broadcast network, and has a net profit that is almost at the level of the budget of the broadcast. So you can meet with smaller audiences. It's just a matter of, at this point, I think, of keeping the quality up.
Well, we can't. I mean, you're absolutely right. The profit motive underlies everything, including prices. Prices is a problem. The reason the election went haywire, I think it probably attributed to the fact that Voters News Service, which was financed jointly by the networks and by CNN, rather than having their own operations where there would have been 4 streams of information and perhaps there would have been different reporting on different networks. I would also add to that the closeness of the election revealed that our politicians believe television. Gore and Bush both made a move based on what they saw on television. When we talk of new generations in the old days, I mean, the presidents I know the most about, during elections, John Kennedy, Richard Nixon would make a couple of phone calls to people they actually knew in some city of Florida or wherever, and made their conclusions that television was getting it wrong. But it turned out that our candidates, and all of us, are so tied to this now, that there was no check whatever on a single source of information. We now know made some mistakes, but television was no longer willing to put up the money to compete, as it were, with itself, with the other networks. So it does underlie everything we've talked about here today. I want to apologize for Marvin Kittman being funny, and thank you for being a terrific audience. It's certainly making our time worthwhile.
I want to remind you all that Mr. Reeves is an author and his books are still for sale. I would like to thank the panel on behalf of the school. In this school, we give a pass-fail. There are no grades, and I think at least 3 of them pass. And I would like to inform the audience that it too passes, and it now has 15 minutes to wander about, and will reconvene. Thank you.
Marvin, don't give it up. Yeah.